Afternoon, everybody. How are you feeling? Good. Packed house, so I think you made the right choice. There's a song by Vanessa Williams that says, "Save the best till last." So I guess that's what I'm thinking. I'm unashamedly geeky about this. I've already tweeted that I've met Euan and Harold Jarch in the same kind of context. So my name's Perry Timms. I'm delighted to be chairing this session. Literally, it's a kind of yes moment for me, because the book Organisations Don't Tweet, People Do. It's kind of an epic for somebody like me, who was accused many years ago of just mucking around on social networks. And actually, it's kind of my job now. One of the things I've got that I'm really pleased about is I've got a license to operate in this field because I'm the social media and engagement advisor to the CIPD. So as a result of it, I'm starting to kind of take Euan's philosophies forward and so on. So I'm just going to give you an introduction, and I've saved this one up because I haven't embarrassed any of my other speakers, but I'm going to try and embarrass Euan. So I think he's the Batman of the social web. He's the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight. So think of the social web as Gotham City, and Euan is our Batman because he fights evil habits, he protects innocent behaviours, and he leads to serve. But in all seriousness, I better do the proper biog now. International speaker and author of Organisations Don't Tweet, People Do. That's 2 plugs for the book. Euan Semple is one of the few people in the world who can turn the complex world of the social web into something we can understand, and at the same time learn how to get the most of it. 12 years ago, working in a senior position at the BBC, Euan was one of the first to introduce what has since become known as social media tools into a large, successful organisation. He's subsequently, for 7 years, of unique experience working with KPMG, Nokia, the World Bank and NATO, and he's here today for us. That's why I'm unashamedly geeky about this. So I can't wait to see what unravels. I'm just going to get out of the way, and Euan, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much. As they say, follow that. Actually, it's funny because somebody did refer. I had an office in Television Centre called Digilab, which was down in the basement under TC7, where they used to record Jules Holland. So on a weekly basis, my office would kind of like bounce up and down and throb to whatever was going on upstairs. And while we were doing I'll talk a little bit about what we did at the BBC. While we were doing that, somebody referred to my office as the Batcave, because it was where I sat and I came out and pounced on people. I'm not quite sure about having my book described as an epic. I thought it was quite short, digestible chapters rather than something you had to wade through, but whatever. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about change, as the topic suggests. Some of the challenges, some of the insights that I gained both at the BBC and elsewhere. I'm going to talk a little bit about social to begin with, and just going to get that out of the way, as it were. And in terms of change, it was funny, I was watching a presentation this morning of some internal social collaboration stuff, and sort of found myself thinking, gosh, this is actually 13 years on from when we did what we did at the BBC. And I do find it fascinating that this social thing that's meant to be happening really fast and incredibly trendy, and it's actually taking an incredibly long time. In fact, a conversation this morning, I was also remembering my first incursion onto the internet, which is what I think we're really talking about, was 21. Or my first experience of the power of this was 21 years ago. Because prior to that, I'd mucked around on terminal emulators looking at libraries in universities in the States, which is all you could do when it sort of came out of DARPANET and ARPANET, whatever else. And then Mosaic arrived, so we had this browser. And I was on, some of you may remember Usenet. I was looking for information about it. Actually, your part of the world, Harold. I was getting a ferry from Vancouver to Vancouver Island and wanted tips on the best ferry to get. So I went on to Alt-Rec Travel MISC Canada and asked the question, and had people come back who I'd never met, who I would never meet, who had no obligation to me whatsoever, give me really thoughtful, detailed answers about which was the best ferry to get, and even down to which was the best cafe on which boat. And I can remember it just sort of blowing me away, that here I was in my house in Buckinghamshire, able to ask this to one level inane question and get these wonderful answers 21 years ago. And it's what we still sometimes find really hard inside organisations, to ask that dumb question, to get access to the people that work inside the organisation, to learn from each other. You know, one of the other speakers I heard this morning was Nigel Payne, who was my boss's boss at the BBC. And Nigel was talking about the formal world of learning. I'll come back to this in some of the bits later. And the sort of language that we use is something that I quite often start off by just taking issue with, in as much as the idea of discrete learning seems odd to me as this separate thing. It's like the word social seems odd to me. You know, we slap the word social onto activities and tools. In fact, nowadays it's hard to find something that doesn't have the word social slapped on the front of it. Or the word digital. You know, that's always a slight warning sign to me, because we slap the word digital on it because it means other. Oh yes, we have a digital department, or we do digital. And it's not digital, it's life. It's how we increasingly live our lives. And that's why I was saying I think what we're talking about is the internet and the impact of the internet on our lives, excuse me, on our business lives, our work lives. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Excuse me while I lose my voice. Just wanted to start with to get a feel for me of who we have in the room. How many of you are in training jobs as such? Pretty much most of you. I'm going to guess most of you in reasonably sized organisations. Anybody in anything under 5,000, say? Okay, so I guess mostly big corporations then. How many of you have some kind of social thingy? Interesting. How many of you have had it for more than a year? Okay, any of you want to maybe share the experiences thus far?
We use Yammer, like a lot of organisations. We originally used Mingle, and when it was first brought into the organisation, we had Yammer and Mingle. Mingle was for the IT guys, and it was a social network.
Ironically called Mingle, you're doing that, you know.
Yammer was for the others, and it was a social networking site, whereas Mingle was built as a scientific networking site, which was very interesting. So they were built very differently. And over time, we've gone to one system, which is now Yammer, and there seems to be a very split in the organisation, because those that were brought up on the one that was part of the scientific felt that they could go there and fairly easily find the information that they wanted, whereas Yammer was much more of those in the other session who's going to sit hard tonight, you know.
Yeah.
What trade should I get? So there is a kind of frustration in different camps that people can't find the information that they want, or they're being sort of told to use it, but how do I use it? But one extreme versus the other extreme, we've got folks that now love the fact that it's just open and in and out, and you can ask what the hell you want.
Really interesting. Anyone else got some reflections they'd like to share? Yeah.
We've had a Yammer implementation about 3.5 years ago, which about after 3 weeks the organisation pulled, and they got scared. And then, and I tried to push using it, but we weren't having it at the time. Now we've got Chatter, which it's been rolled out just to the HR community, and then slowly other communities have been kind of using it. And we also just recently built a collaboration site built off of WordPress. So now we've got a situation where we've got a few different collaboration portals, but no kind of one that everybody uses and that everybody collaborates on. And the newest latest one, that one that got built, doesn't seem to be being utilised very much.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, just to sort of pick up on some of the themes on that, and because even 13 years ago when we did this at the BBC, there were already, R&D already had wikis, and they had blogs, and they had bulletin boards. And I got given the job title of Director of Knowledge Management. And going back to the point about language, I was always burdened with the language of knowledge management, because people still talk about extracting knowledge, capturing knowledge. Harvesting knowledge is one of my favourites. It's like some cerebral milking machine that sucks the good stuff out of staff's heads and then leaves these empty husks. And then we wondered why nobody got involved in knowledge management. But as that director of knowledge management, I could have taken the view that we should shut down all these messy things, all these things that were already going. And back to your point, the reason we needed me to do something else was they were in small pockets. They were quite tribal. They had separate tools for separate reasons. So my inclination was to get it as big and pervasive for everybody as fast as I could. To do that, I didn't want to hack off the people who'd already shown some inclination to do it. So why would I shut down the things that were already trying to get some traction? So I took the view that we just had to make ours bigger and better from whatever perspective as possible. And that mixed perspective was really interesting as well, because I was at a thing the other day for an accounting firm where somebody who was called head of innovation stood up in front of an audience of about 100 people and sneered at people sharing photographs of cats on Facebook. And you could feel the whole audience kind of heckling, thinking, does he really think that's all we do on Facebook these days? So you still have that reaction against the social, against the chattering. But I realized that these are sociable spaces. And unless there's some chatting, there's no reason to go there. You have to give people some kind of energy, some kind of connection to make them come into the spaces when they can then have the proper grown-up work questions. But it also affects things like structure, which I'll come back to later. But we started off with a very simple tool. And I'm very aware that I'm standing talking at a conference about learning technologies. But my day job at the BBC, if you like, was looking at broadcast technologies. And walking around the show floor this morning was a bit like being in NAB in Vegas, where the media was being bombarded with computing in the sort of heyday of computing taking over all the editing and all the production for television. And it was just the same. It was over-engineered, overpriced, overcomplicated stuff. And I came away from this morning feeling bewildered. And actually what I think we're talking about 90% of the time is text boxes. Whether it's Facebook or Yammer or Twitter or blogging or whatever else, a little text box that you write something in and you press save and it goes off somewhere else. It's not rocket science. And any half-decent geek could build you a blogging platform for a couple of £100, never mind tens and hundreds of thousands. But the point of that is that the complexity that the technology brings is a problem. Because, we could have put in learning systems, we could have put in knowledge management systems. All I wanted was people having bloody interesting conversations with each other. And I was going to do what it took to get that to happen. And some of that meant fighting off people who wanted structure. So when we started, we only had two spaces. One space to ask a question, the other to have a natter. And that kind of nicely separated the two a little bit. And it made it really easy. People didn't have to think too much about where they were going to do something. So the friction to get started was quite low. And we got up to about 6,000 users on that basis. And for me, it was gloriously messy. It was straggly. There was people following threads, asking questions, sharing stuff, learning from each other in a way that to me was very navigable. And I'll come back again to this metaphor later, but it was like paths that you could follow. But once it became big enough, people who didn't quite understand that began to notice it and think, what's this thing that Euan's been mucking about with? And then they wanted me to tidy it up. They wanted me to make it more structured. And I lost the battles, and we changed the tool, and we ended up with a more structured platform that nearly killed it. What saved it was having the water cooler bit at the top, which allowed people to kind of gravitate there for those conversations again. So I'm mentioning all of that as a kind of example of a number of things, I guess. One is having to accommodate the expectations of an organization that you're trying to implement change into. You can't be talking to a former CIO of BP the other day who was saying you have to be a tame enough troublemaker that they don't fire you, but still retain your instincts as a change agent, as a troublemaker, if you like. I think the other thing was to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. I spent a long time writing strategy papers for John Birt and just getting blank looks from the guy, because I was trying to build a world that he had no experience of, and it wasn't how he got to where he was. And again, this is what's funny. I mean, just talking about the book, the book's been out a couple of years. I'm seeing more talking about it now than I did 2 years ago, because I think people are now starting to get to this type of situation where you're dealing with these issues. What I think we're actually talking about, and this goes way back to a book called The Clue Train Manifesto, which I would still recommend as a kind of essential book to read about this stuff, if you like. Written by some guys who really got the internet, got marketing, got business. A number of phrases came out of it. One was from Doc Searls, which is markets are conversations. which is still very much in use. But this one always appealed to me, that the internet is about globally distributed, near-instant, person-to-person conversations. And that's what I think we're trying to enable inside our organizations. Now, going back to marrying the disruptive with the structured, I was asked to come up with a job description for my boss for a form he had to fill in. So I said, it's increasing the frequency and the quality of the conversations that get your job done, which I thought was pretty work-like, pretty grown-up, pretty focused. I was told I couldn't use the word conversation because it wasn't business-like enough. But if you're able to get this happening, it's the speed of it. It's the fact that you can learn instantly when something's happened. We had internal comms channels who would send all staff emails, but once our platform got up to 25,000 users, they stopped doing it because we already knew what the news was, because we'd already been speaking to the people who triggered the news, and their emails were becoming increasingly awkward. The globally distributed bit, the BBC is a big straggly organisation, like I guess many that you work in, and Radio Cumbria, there's 2 engineers and a sheep, and until we put our platform in, the guys there had minimal impact on the rest of the organisation. But once we had this type of technology, by consistently answering worthwhile questions, they started to gain profile, gain access, be able to have more impact on the organisation. And in fact, Harold and I were just talking about the fact that he lives in a remote part of Canada, but we're able to become friends. He's able to operate a business despite geographical distance. Now, ironically, inside an organisation, you can be in the same open plan office, and you might as well be in a remote part of Canada, because you don't know where the other person is and what they do and why they might be interesting or helpful to you. And you don't maybe have meetings together, so you might as well be walking on parallel paths. So breaking that down inside organisations is important. But again, conscious I'm talking about a conference about technology, it's about the person-to-person bit. So one of my criteria for all of the tools we used was it had to be able to enhance and make it more likely that more people would connect with other people. And pretty much anything that got in the way of that, you tried to take out, including some of the language. Again, I got the word community taken off all of our software, because I hated it when people talk about, oh yes, we will form communities and we will manage communities. No, people behave communally if they feel like it, if you've done lots of subtle things and got things right. And if you still taught the language of forming and managing communities, you'll have people pulling back from it. Something else we were talking about this morning is that there's an aspect of these tools that appeals to the disenfranchised. Talking to Donald about digital technologies in the hands of young kids, or in Africa or wherever. People take to these tools because they don't currently have access to a voice or have means of influencing people. So there's something inherently, not bottom up, because frankly you can be a middle manager and have nobody listening to you just as much as you can at the bottom of the organisation. But there's something about enabling those who don't currently have status. I won't go into the detail on this slide, but it's just, I'm using it partly to show the fact that these are screen grabs from my mobile phone. And this is how most of this happens nowadays. Again, whatever systems you put in formally, more and more of us are using our own devices to access this stuff. And they're personal devices, they're intimate devices. I keep it close to my chest or other bits of my anatomy that I care about. And if a manager or a trainer or marketing are going to get into my space, they're going to have to behave themselves. They're going to have to add value, because otherwise I've got much more interesting choices available to me. And again, somebody was talking this morning about just using Facebook for your learning platform. If that's where people are spending their time, why not just go out and spend time there with them? Why not help them learn there? I did a set of strategy work with the Open University where we were talking about what they called social learn, which was getting over the idea of having to come to even a virtual separate place. Because actually I'm quite busy learning all the time on the internet. I don't want to have to stop that and come to learn somewhere over there. Why can't you come to where I am and help me learn better and faster where I'm doing it already? And accredit me for it, make it proper, professional, have measurements, whatever. But accommodate the way I'm learning nowadays. And just briefly, the tools there, blogging still has huge potential. Just the process of having a blog makes me notice more. I might write about this someday. Why am I noticing it? What is interesting? What might interest other people? I become more observant. And if you're in a profession, if you're in a business that you've got a particular skill, having that mechanism to just make you think a little bit harder about what you're doing is a very powerful self-learning process. But if you then share that with other people, if you get good at writing those 3 or 4 paragraph optimal blog posts that catch the essence of something, then other people pick up on that and learn. Middle's Facebook, and it's interesting, despite that comment from the chap the other day there about the Facebook photographs of cats, it's interesting watching Facebook growing up. I think more and more people are using Facebook for more interesting stuff. I did some work with the European Commission, and Maria Podlasiak-Ziegler, who's she's Director General Education for the Commission, was cynical, came to a conference that I was speaking at, skeptical of the internet, went away a bit more enthused, went back to the Commission where they've got Yammer internally, found it, took to it like a duck to water, started finding all these interesting people she didn't even know existed in her own organisation, and then went out on the internet and is now forming closed Facebook groups to connect with the disadvantaged youth that are her responsibility, which is fantastic. Because, Maria's my kind of age. She's not your archetypical Gen Y web type person, but she's just suddenly taken to this platform, which is outside the boundaries of her organisation, to have these cracking conversations with people that she's meant to be helping. And then with Twitter, I mean, Twitter's, I guess like most of you, when I first saw Twitter, I thought, I need this like a hole in the head. More inane rubbish from people I don't know. And unless you make some effort, that is what you get on Twitter. But I now wouldn't do without it, because Twitter is my access to a number of things. Firstly, it's my access to really filtered information. I follow about 100 people on Twitter. And I have a tool that lets me only see that 100 people's tweets. So I don't see the noise. I don't see the celebrity. I don't see all the broadcast media stuff on Twitter. I just see the output from those 100 people. And they're there because they're good hunters and gatherers. They find the good stuff. They filter out the rubbish. And they make it more likely that I will find stuff relevant and interesting to me faster. But the second thing that's available to me is the resource of other people's knowledge. And the example I use here is I was taking part in a webinar with a university in the States, and the software they were using for some reason wasn't finding the camera on my laptop. So I'm looking at the prospect of a blank screen facing these 200 people in this conference center. And I couldn't find any answers on the help. And this is about learning as well. I couldn't find anything in the structured content in the help files. There was nobody on the help desk because it was the wrong time of day for them. I pushed the question into Twitter, and within 10 seconds, 4 people had told me the settings to change. Now, I can't think of another way I could have done that. Let's talk about just-in-time learning. Now, that worked because there's about 8,500 people follow me on Twitter. Of them, enough of them knew the answer, enough of them were online at the time, and enough of them were favourably disposed towards me and felt like putting the effort into answering the question. So I have to feed that network. I have to feed them interesting stuff. I have to not abuse their attention spans by filling it with inane stuff about coffees. Which doesn't mean I don't say I'm having a coffee sometimes. Because I was in Washington recently and I had a coffee and I tweeted that out. And as a result ended up being bought lunch by a major in the US Marines and shown around the Smithsonian by one of its curators. That wouldn't have happened if they hadn't known I was in Washington, and they wouldn't have known I was in Washington if I hadn't said, I'm having a nice coffee in this downtown Starbucks. Okay? So again, that's the thing about the triviality and the value. If you're too businesslike, if you don't say I'm having a coffee, that doesn't happen. But if all you say is I'm having a coffee, then nobody's going to follow you. So it's managing the networks, it's managing the in and out and the value, the kind of ebb and flow. And I'll tell that story later. It's about being collectively curious. One of the things I find most frustrating about dealing with big organizations and people in them is the lack of curiosity. They've been trained not to be curious. Oh, you're not paid to wonder about things. You're not paid to think about things that aren't your job. You're just paid to process that set of stuff that I've given you, because that's what you're measured on and that's what you'll get paid for. So we miss all that other stuff that's going on around us that could save us loads of money or could give us opportunities we wouldn't have otherwise. And these tools rely on being good at going, ooh, that's interesting. Being discerning. Having a good eye, and you develop this. After 13 years of blogging, I'm more, as I said, acute about what I think, that's really interesting. And if you get it right, other people go, oh, that's interesting. And they start rebroadcasting your blog post or your tweet. And if you do that over a length of time, you start to begin to be known as somebody who knows what they're talking about. And that's how you build reputation. That's how you become an expert these days, is by that in and out. I described myself the other day as an internet bivalve. You know, one of these little shell things that just take in shit and put out, well, actually it might be the other way around, but who knows. But, but you know, that ebb and flow of stuff. And then linking to it, you know, people, again, the tools obscure this, but actually what we're doing is pointing with the hyperlink, saying that's the book to read, that's the person to talk to, that's the document that showed you what we did the last time. And then we've got things like hashtags to help us organize this. You know, it was a friend of mine, Chris Messina, who invented the hashtag, and he did so one day 5 years ago because on Twitter, originally, we didn't even have the @ sign. It was just 140 characters. So some of us began to use the @ sign to indicate that this is for @Euan. And then Chris said, why don't we add metadata to our tweets? Why don't we put the hash sign in front of a word so that it indicates that this tweet is about that word, and off we go. And now look at it, 5 years later, you can't move without hashtags. Even my kids, who are teenagers, go hashtag annoyed, you know? And they get really fed up when I go, I know the guy who invented that. Actually, probably an indiscreet but hopefully funny story. I was in Sydney last year doing a set of conferences, and one of the organisers took me to this club. And Antoine's a very good-looking, handsome, French, cheeky chappie who kept going on about this special room in this club that he wanted me to see. So I'm already getting a bit nervous as a happily married 53-year-old with 2 kids. So we end up knocking on this door, and this gorgeous-looking girl in a you know, very sophisticated dress answers the door, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what's Antoine getting me into? So we get in, and there's girls standing around drinking and talking to the people who are there. So I'm getting really nervous. And we sat on this sofa and we started chatting, and I'm talking about work, about the internet, and I start telling the story about Chris and inventing the hashtag. And this gorgeous blonde draped over the back of the sofa looked at me and said, you know the guy who invented the hashtag? And I thought, how weird is that? You know? Suddenly this geeky bloke's solution to a geeky problem is cool enough that I can look trendy in this bar in Australia. And I didn't capitalise on that. That's So I think, you know, and going back to the topic and the things we're talking about today, I mean, a lot of this is, I think, deindustrialization. You know, we've had 50, maybe 100 years of structure, titles, silos, Taylorist kind of views of organizations, which most of our software still reflects, most of our organizations still assume. This is starting to pull that apart, or it's falling apart, frankly. I think it's, you know, there's partly this is pushing it, but it's also falling apart under its own weight at the moment. You know, big corporates are just struggling to cope with the burdens that they place themselves under. You know, again, I find it funny that people will sneer at Twitter who will spend their whole lives writing 40-page reports that nobody reads, or attending meetings that never agree anything. You know, that whole busyness of keeping that machine going is such a drain on the core that's trying to do something. And that's what I think we're seeing, the falling apart or the pulling apart. And it also relies on us finding our voice. This is a phrase we always used at the beginning of blogging, that you find your voice, you get into a rhythm, you start to find a way of saying things that suits you, that works. And it's ridiculously difficult. You know, I remember my first job as a line manager, where I was terrified at the responsibility that, you know, being in charge of 50 guys, some of whom were old enough to be my dad. And I started to wear a tie and talk funny to protect myself from the enormity of this. And that language, that whole language of business that we kind of slip into, it's really hard not to slip into, that shorthand jargon, you know, employee engagement. You know, words like that just send a shiver down your spine. We've got so used to it, we almost don't notice it. But you can't get away with that on these online platforms. This whole thing about authenticity and finding your voice, if you talk like that, nobody will listen. You have to remember how to talk normally. I'm watching people trying to do this, sometimes hysterical. Watching people, like, you know, I don't know if you saw the British Gas and the Ryanair and the JP Morgan Twitter fiascos before Christmas, where senior executives are pushed out in front of their organizations on Twitter and expected to be down with the kids. And I've started to describe it as a bit like watching your dad dancing at a disco. You know, you're proud of them for having a go, but you really wish they'd sit down. It's hard. I never underestimate that. That thing of asking dumb questions, talking in plain language, offering an answer. It requires this. It also requires thinking. I did some work with an accounting firm whose strapline was thought leadership. And I slightly cheekily said, how can you be thought leaders if nobody knows what you think? And again, we have marketing that's sanitized, that's all saying the same stuff. The thought gets lost in it. We're also not encouraged to think. Going back to the curiosity thing, you haven't got time to think. You're too busy. What are you doing sitting around thinking? But if you haven't thought first, you won't see anything worth listening to, and you won't get the networks. David Weinberger, who was one of the writers of the Clue Train, once described blogging as writing ourselves into existence. And this is sort of getting into the thing about change. Because social media happens, or this stuff, whatever we call it, happens one person at a time. And for their reasons, not yours. That's kind of inevitable. You can't mandate blogging. And it also happens when you start it. Not somebody else. You can't be head of blogging or head of social and expect everybody else to do it. I've seen this so many times. People put in the platforms and I'll ask them, how are you getting on with Jive or Tibber or whatever? Oh, they're not using it. Well, are you using it? Oh, no, I'm too busy. Right? So the sell, if you like, is this. Once you start doing it, it's like evolution on steroids. It's this, you punt an idea out, you get reflections back on it, you get disagreement, you get reinforcement, you learn from that, you do it again. This is why I now couldn't do without blogging. It's almost biological for me. I've been doing it for so much of the time for so long that it feels like some of my synapses fire outside my head and some of them inside my head. And the ones outside are much better. But that's what you start to grow into. And if you do that over time, you leave a trace. Going back to all that nonsense about knowledge capture and knowledge harvesting, we leave trails, we leave rediscoverable trails that people can piggyback on. With the ultimate irony, and this is no advert for getting involved in this stuff, I was ultimately made redundant at mutual agreement from the BBC. But the week before I left, I was asked to take part in a senior level meeting on how to prevent knowledge leaving the organisation. And as I said, unlike most who are leaving, I've left a trace. I've left paths. I've left multiple paths that people can rediscover, unlike some buried document. And once you get enough of this, you end up seeing really interesting patterns. And a lot of this is about patterns and surfacing patterns and being curious about patterns. And the analogy I always use is that what I thought we were seeing was what's on the left, which is a Cotswold village. Old villages grew up messily, haphazardly. Nobody predetermined the architectural style or said you all had to have red roofs. But they work. They feel human. You can navigate your way around them comfortably. Most organizational IT systems and intranets are like Milton Keynes, which is the bottom right photograph there, which I don't know about you, but I get lost every time I'm in Milton Keynes, even with a sat-nav. And it's got this logic. It's got these straight roads and roundabouts, but they all look the same. And they don't map to my logic. So I can't navigate it. So again, LMSs, all the stuff, all the technology, all the language, all the categorizations, all the structure, it's too much like Milton Keynes and not enough like a Cotswold village. Now, in fact, you want both. You want one overlaying the other. And the conversational stuff, rediscovering and refining your structured managed stuff, you don't throw all that out. Something else that's a bit counterintuitive is a lot of management has been about tidying up. Training has been about getting the good stuff. And we've become so good at that. We've become so good at reducing the noise that we've been at risk of reducing the signal as well. So we don't say an awful lot. If you want to get the signal back, you have to let people make more noise. You have to have more rubbish. You have to allow people to talk more rubbish, frankly. Because partly one person's rubbish is somebody else's gold dust. It's that little weak signal that talks about the O-ring that prevents BP from getting into trouble or whatever else it is. It's those little bits of information that look inconsequential that sometimes have real interest. So you can't sanitize that all out. And this is an idea that often appeals to people is that and again, going back to how you bring about change, I don't think you have, and this is one of the challenges with big, expensive systems like Jive or Tibber. If you're having to invest hundreds of thousands of pounds, you get sucked into that old thing of having a big initiative and having a big comms plan, which people just have lumbering at them and frightens them off so they go back to Facebook. Small things, and this is an idea originally from a consultant called Peter Fryer from Hull, which is Trojan mice. So little things that aren't what they appear, that don't cost too much, don't require too much permission, could be an individual act, could be a small bit of software, could just be a meeting with a bunch of people who already look like they're trying to do this sort of stuff. Those kind of things. And I'm always into kind of like productivity and getting better at doing things, including getting fit. And I was just reading a book about getting into habits related to fitness and how we all start off the new year trying to do the right thing but give up because we've overloaded ourselves with expectations. And the book talks about ridiculously small steps. So for me, I've tried for years to do yoga, never got around to it, never found the time. Now I do 2 warrior poses in the bathroom just before I get in the bath, every morning. And it's been a month, and I haven't missed a day yet. And it's really funny, because this rat has been trained. You know? And I think that's how you do it in businesses as well. You just keep doing it. You just do that 1 blog post a week. It becomes easier. You have 1 change a week. You talk to 1 person a week. I think it's kind of intrinsic in this way of looking at the world. And this is a great saying from the American Marines, which actually my team used as a kind of motto for us as we try to duck and dive through the BBC, which is keep moving, stay in touch, and head for the high ground. So again, I quite often get asked to help corporations with their strategies for this stuff. And I'm so tempted to turn my back on all that money that's available and say, nah, just do that. So I tend to make it long-winded and say that in a longer way. But that's what I'm saying. You know, have a rough idea of where the high ground is, keep doing things, and keep talking to each other. I think is the tactics. And be strategically tactical. You know, and I talk in the book about you can sell the idea of being strategically tactical upwards. Instead of those perfect strategies that predict a 3-year future, blah, blah, how many of them have actually ever come true? But this is more tactical. So, back to the words and the last sort of few hopefully provocative ideas. This blurring is happening in a lot of organizations, partly because of the technologies. Is it comms? Is it communicating? Is it learning? You know, is it your area of profession, or is it just doing stuff? And doing stuff in a way that's visible, traceable, learnable from. I would suggest it's all of them, and I think the language is beginning to be a bit of a burden. As is what I call the perils of professionalism. The inclination to be a professional something. You know, I did an event for professional communicators last week, and I said every time somebody introduces themselves as that to me, it makes me think, well, what am I after 53 years? A rank amateur. You know, likewise with learning, you know, professional, it's kind of odd, it jars. And you then get the hierarchy, you get the status, you get the defensiveness. You know, part of the reason change doesn't happen is that people have a lot invested in the status quo. They are head of something. And to suggest that that something's about to vaporize and people are doing it for themselves, you know, they put up their defenses. And this idea of lifelong learning as well, what's the alternative? You know, do you just get to a point where you decide you're full? Stick your hands, you know, no, you know, I've learned enough. Sort of going back to thinking about discrete learning. Well, I only learn when I'm in a class. No, I'm learning all the time. I'm learning standing at bus stops, whatever, using my phone. And I get this pushback quite a lot. Because clearly what I'm talking about is slightly utopian, and it's about people, you know, taking responsibility and whatever. And I've had several people over the years say to me, it's not reasonable to expect people to think at work. You know, that's beyond the call of normal duty. They don't want to think. They just go to work to process stuff, stay safe, keep their heads down, get to 50 and retire. I don't think that's inevitable. I think we train them to be like that. I think we train them to think it's risky to do other than that. I think from school on, we are trained to some extent not to think for ourselves. And certainly in Britain, not to share it with other people, not, you know, who are you to think that? Who are you to say that? And, you know, it would be foolish of me not to acknowledge that there is a dark side. You know, this stuff can be used, people can waste time with it. There are risks involved in sharing both to the individual and to organizations. I know people who have tried and retired from this, if you like, who've just found it too much. Who found it too full on, too intensive, too intrusive, and have walked away from it. I know lots of people who walk away and then come back because they miss it. So I think it's partly this is about just taking responsibility to look after yourselves in these spaces. If the brakes are off and the responsibility is all on you, that takes a bit of managing. You know, it's why I meditate and climb mountains, just to shut the bloody stuff off once in a while. And somebody at the BBC once called me an organisational anarchist, which I was quite chuffed at. I thought, I'll have that on a T-shirt. That's quite... And it still makes people slightly uncomfortable, because I think we are talking about a very disruptive technology. And back to the comment earlier from one of you about Yammer. You know, you're not alone. I heard of another organisation recently who got further down the road and got successful. You know, Yammer was working, and they switched it off. And you're thinking, no, that was what it was for, guys. It was that disruption. It was that melting pot. That's what these things are for. So you might as well be upfront about it and get comfortable with it. And if you look at the actual dictionary definition of anarchism, kind of ignoring the first bit a little bit, the organisation of society on a voluntary cooperative basis without recourse to force or compulsion. What's wrong with that in your organisation? You know, it's like a friend of mine, Tracy Fenton, runs a competition for the world's most democratic organisations. And some people get really jumpy when you talk about, democratic organisation. I like running mine as a fascist state. It's what I always wanted, you know. You know, I think this is about enabling, about responsible behaviour, about trusting people. And it's hard to find things not to like with that, frankly. So last couple of things. One is the fact that Zappos were always held up as a poster child of social. They were very good at doing social internally, externally. The chief exec, the board, they all blogged. The staff all blogged all their websites. They're a clothing company from the States. They recently announced that they're doing away with, well, it's been misconstrued and overblown, but they've sort of done away with hierarchy. They're doing away with formal structures and job titles and managerial roles as such. They're not completely, there's been a whole set of pushback about what does it actually mean. They have a word called holacracy that they have used, which is Greek for overlapping circles. But I'm mentioning them, whether it's going to work or not, just as an example of what begins to become an obvious way to move forward when you've spent enough time in these online networks. You know, as the old world of formal structures begins to look a bit silly and out of date, the thought of doing things like this begins to look more sensible. And I think that's the kind of transition I would suggest we're trying to enable in our organisations. So couple of last plugs. I do a podcast on this with Megan Murray from the States. And the reason I'm mentioning this is twofold. One, to mention it because you might be interested, but also not to neglect this as an idea of learning. Megan and I used to have regular Skype calls where we would just between us be trying to work out what was happening and why it was interesting and what we thought of it. And one day I said, why don't we just record these and make them available to other people? So don't pretend it's radio, don't it, don't put, we put a jingle in the front and the back, but that's about it. And it's doing reasonably well. Why not do that inside your organisation? Why not have people just having conversations that you record, that you make available, and use all of that? So anyway, last one. And thank you very much for letting me ramble on. Thank you.
As you would hope, there's been lots of tweetable content, so the hashtag's gone mad. So in your on your phone, you've got stacks of them, and I apologise for that. We're not spamming, honestly. But I'm hoping there's some synapses firing in the audience for some questions, because it's not often you get 18 minutes to ask somebody like you a question around social business. So yeah, we've got one at the front, and then we've got one at the back there. So let's take the one at the front first. Yep, over here.
I have a kid in the street called Alfie Days, and ordinary kid, and he's got over 1 million followers on YouTube, and he flies first class and was earning more than his parents at 19.
Fantastic.
And it was interesting off the podcast thing at the end there, because I have two boys that are twins at 20, and their default search engine now is YouTube. I discovered this by looking over their shoulders. I was surprised at this.
Yeah.
I had assumed that everybody used Google as the primary source.
Yeah.
But the rise of video and the sharing of video has,
Yep.
you know, I think this is a bit of a turning point here.
Yes.
And I just wanted to put any views on that one.
Yes, and a confession that I don't tend to talk to, having worked in broadcasting for 20 odd years, I don't tend to talk about video or audio or whatever else, but you're right. I mean, and whatever mechanism it helps to get people sharing, and you're right, again, the phones are making it so easy. And I've thought for years, why can't engineering firms just give all their staff or let them use their own mobile phone and just video that widget that you've just learned how to undo that people have been frightened about for years, or just do a talking head, just do a selfie. about something you've just learned and stick it. But of course, then you get hung up about, oh, intranets, and we've not got the bandwidth, and IT won't let us access YouTube, and bugger that, get out on the internet.
Use Snapchat.
Yeah, whatever. I actually did some work in Hong Kong recently, and 2 of the financial groups that I was working with confessed under their breath that their senior board members used WhatsApp to communicate with each other without permission from IT. And they basically just thought, they've watched their kids doing this thinking, why can't I have some of that?
Anarchy everywhere. There was a question at the back, thanks.
Yeah.
You spoke about not saying we're going to make social communities or make these networks in an artificial way.
Yep.
Which is grand true. How would you suggest going about creating these tools in an organisation so they are used without it being a forced artificial
Yep.
top-down heavy approach?
Good question. Because it doesn't just happen. You know, it's not laissez-faire. You don't just put the tools in and people immediately take to them. I think it takes a lot of conversations. And you know, I spent a lot of my time walking up and down talking to whoever would listen to me about this thing and showing them this thing and just cajoling them into using this thing. And we then used the network to grow the network. So we would talk to the early adopters and say, look, we'd really like if you could go out and start to explain to other people what this thing is. If you see somebody asking a question in meet space, show them the tool, bring them in and let them understand how this thing works. Being curious, again, you know, as the one, I'm going to use air quotes, responsible for this, I just kept watching it obsessively. So I had subscriptions for every single topic, so I was getting 400, 500 emails a day off the system, but I could just scan them and just, oh, that's interesting. They've done something new, and so I'd then tell that story back into the system, and people, oh yeah, that is interesting, why don't we do that? Or if we had issues, instead of me being the manager who'd sort of jump on anything that was going wrong and tell people how to behave, I learned to sit on my hands and allow them the time to start working it out amongst themselves. And that builds a kind of robust, even in relatively small numbers, a robust core, if you like. And that is how communities, that's how a community in real life grows, is people learning the ropes and working together for some other purpose. And so I think you cultivate that by asking good questions, by being obsessively interested, by getting out of the way at every chance you get, but also defending it. You know, because the organic metaphor works. It's like a little shoot or multiple shoots. And part of your job is to fend off the bad guys until it gets big enough.
Okay, one behind you.
Sorry. Crunch.
Just behind you there.
Behind me, sorry.
I was just going to ask you, you know, are there organisations or companies out there where you think, look, they've got this and they're just flying in their space and it's, they're exemplar in kind of what you imagine?
If I had a penny for every time somebody asked that, very few, frankly. It's partly why I mentioned Zappos. I mean, there are some that are bits of some. In fact, we were talking to somebody from Shell earlier. You know, Shell have been doing this from way back. Andy Boyd, who ran their bulletin boards, was one of my heroes when I started doing it. So there are bits, but even people like IBM, you know, I get taken into IBM on a reasonable, regular basis because there's big chunks of IBM just don't get it. There is an argument that people like Lee Bryant are making that maybe it's never going to happen fully in a big organization. You know, I sometimes do wonder if I'm spending my life trying to resuscitate dinosaurs. And he's sort of saying, well, you go with a small to middle and grow the culture as you... I don't know. I think there are autonomous enough bits of big organizations that are doing this well. The other slightly unkind and unfair thing I sometimes say is stop reading case study porn and get on with it.
Make up your own.
Exactly. There's a lot of people waiting to just get that perfect example. Think, all right, now I'll do it. Be too late. Just if you care, you know, if you care enough, have a go.
I mean, I think certainly in the organisation that I work for, it's a not-for-profit organisation, and it's like a trade association. So we have 4,000
Right.
people all in independent practice, and it's their organisation. It's there to support them.
Yep.
And they kind of have an ambition that they're trying to achieve something. We found in the last sort of 5 years of development, the most powerful force that we've evoked is trying to establish, understand and then promote our own internal culture.
Yep.
And it's that seems to drive
Yes.
the behaviour.
Yes.
You know, in other words, we know what we regard as acceptable and welcome behaviour, and if
Yes.
enough people buy into that, then and it's sort of
Yes.
similar online, really, isn't it?
Totally, and that's what I was saying about, you know, the meta conversations. Have conversations about your conversations.
Yeah, have conversations.
You know, talk about this tool. Why is this tool working this way? Why do people react this way?
So you need somebody in the organisation to kind of just start voicing this
Mm-hmm.
stuff, and then just see who flows in behind them, and someone else will start another
Yep.
conversation, and that's kind of
Yep.
the way in. That's the answer to that
Yep.
chap's question down there.
Yeah. Well, in the very first instance, and even before that, find the other people who are already busting a gut to make it happen, but haven't started yet.
Yeah.
So, you know, I could always tell when you're doing a workshop, and you see people's eyes light up. You know, right, you're one. I'll talk to you afterwards. The rest of you, you know. And that's another thing to watch. Don't throw yourself at too many immovable objects. If you've got people who are really resistant to it, well, it varies. Sometimes they're resistant because they get it. The biggest problem is apathy. People just, they're a waste of your time and energy.
Okay, any more questions? Yep,
Yeah.
on that.
Do you think the size of an organisation matters? You talked about several companies that are very, very large.
Yep.
My company that we're looking to implement something like this into is only less than 2,000 people. Do you think it's any less effective?
Depends on, because again, we're talking about as if it was one thing, which it needn't be. I think in terms of what we have, you know, that kind of all kind of connected. I normally say 2,000 is about the bottom cutoff, because you need enough activity, you need enough energy, and much smaller than that. If you're talking about a general kind of discursive kind of a space, there'll just not be enough happening, and you can talk to each other, or should be anyway. But if you're smaller than that and have a particular reason, like being geographically dispersed, where this tool can really meet the need, or you know, one of these tools might be a wiki that can just suddenly unlock a problem. So again, that's the two tactics. One is just keeping that big, growing, you don't quite know where it's going kind of energy up, and you do need a certain critical mass for that, or spotting opportunities that are small enough, discrete enough, with enough pain that you know just the tool that could help them. And once you get a few of those, then they start to grow into the bigger thing as well. It is very much like an ecology. You know, it's managing an ecology rather than building a machine.
Okay, any more? Yep, one more.
Our organisation introduced Yammer early last year, and I think what we did was right, and what people were already saying in terms of let it grow organically. So it was all word of mouth.
Yep.
People would be saying, "Oh, what you did, Yammer? Oh, that's great. Get lots
Yep.
of information." I think sort of the nail in the coffin's been given because at the end of last year, the HR director, who's responsible for 600 people in the company, said, "I want you to use Yammer. I want you to set up groups in Yammer. I want you to do it this way."
Yep.
So my question is, how can you recover from that? Because people are saying, "Oh, can you?" People are really
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, well, we're told to use it, so."
It is a killer move, isn't it?
Become a management tool rather than an employment tool.
I've heard that happens so often, and that's what I was saying about the disenfranchised, that you've got to be very careful about how many managers you allow in and how they behave when they're in there, because they can kill it really quickly if you're not. That's what I meant about defending it as well. Recovering, it's partly being in it for the long game, and you may not be able to defend it to keep it in there for the long game. But you know, we had bits that would suffer from that kind of thing. But then, well, okay, there's two answers, I guess. One is that thing about having it as broad as you can get, as fast as you can get, because that gives you the diversity of expectations and usage. That means that he might kill off one bit, but other bits have got enough reason to keep going, that they keep the whole thing alive. The other thing is you may have bits that die, but they may then resuscitate at a later stage. And this, again, I'm afraid, comes back to the thing about the tools, because if you've only put in a cheap tool like we had, I had nobody telling me to switch it off because it wasn't costing anything. And that made it easier. So I know it's not always as easy to do that nowadays. But I think it's selling the idea that it's a long game, it's a broad ecology, fending off managers from getting too tiggerish who don't get it. Yeah.
Completely opposite, because we've had Young quite a while, and it's kind of fizzles out and comes back again. There's one guy that's been trying to keep it alive for years. and we kept getting blocked, well, you shouldn't really be using that, it doesn't meet corporate standards, and then suddenly the executive, for some reason, said, I want everybody to be using Yammer. And people went, oh, we're allowed to use it now.
Interesting.
Well, I suspect that their time was if not considered a waste of time, that they would be valuable
Interesting.
to use their time.
As was the fact that you said there was one guy who kept going. That's a consistent pattern in this. There is one person who's just got the bit between their teeth and thinking, bugger it, I'm just going to keep going. And that's what I was like, you know. And that's partly what I was saying earlier about you as as individuals. In fact, I'm thinking of having a form for potential clients that says, do you care? Do you really care? Do you really, really care? Because if you're not going to say yes, we might as well give up now. You know, it's not going to happen until you really welly in and make this happen. And also keep wellying in. You know, because entropy is an incredibly strong force in organizations. But I suppose back to your point as well, you may have a short-term success, but that doesn't mean that the ball's just going to keep rolling. You have to keep pushing. And every time it looks like slowing down, you have to get back in there and push again and re-energize and re-explain. You know?
Okay, got another one over there.
I was just going to say, with regards to that point, with something like Twitter, you don't have to re-energize it. So in terms of what's going on in organisations, why should you keep having to flog a dead horse?
Interesting. Yeah, and again, I have to be honest with clients when they say, well, should we have an internal or an external system? I say, well, who cares? You know? Up to a point. I mean, clearly that, you know, I've worked with people at GCHQ who can't just talk all over Twitter, but with that set aside, I've had so many clients say it's easier to find each other on LinkedIn than on any HR system. You know, and for people nodding around, you know, we can all know, or like Maria at the European Commission, just use Facebook if that's where people are. Now, again, that might involve you in a whole bunch of other difficult arguments with your auditors and the risk people and whatever else. And tip for them, if you get the risk people getting agitated, try and sell this as a platform for them. You know, instead of issuing memos that nobody ever reads about what's risky, if they start blogging about what's risky, people might listen to them and we might all be less risky. Just a thought.
Okay, still got time for a couple? Any more? Yeah, we've got another one behind. Yeah, same again. Go on.
It's all right, no worries.
Really interested in, and just a real quick one. I mean, we're all stuck for resources, you know, and just resources. The only resources available we all have is time, energy, and money. And what I'm getting is you have to spend a lot of time and energy on this. You've got to be prepared to devote just loads of that.
Yes. Well, yes and no. In the sense that when people say to me, oh gosh, how do you find the time to do this? Well, because I'm wedging it in the cracks between other things. You know, you get better at, and likewise with the BBC stuff, I could keep track of that anytime, anywhere, because I had the tools that let me do it in between doing other things. So it's not.
But the more you do, the you get better at it.
And you get better at it. But you have to have an investment of something. And I would again genuinely suggest that money is probably the least appropriate. You know, Scotsman's tip for ROI, keep the I really small and nobody will give you shit about the R. Or, sorry, another one about the ROI question, because that's the other one of these weaselly, pernicious questions. Well, what's the return on investment of this? Well, I'm starting to turn it back on them and say, well, look, it's happening anyway. You explain to me the return on investment of stopping it or ignoring it.
Yeah, got one of that.
My favourite slide you used there was the hyperlink slide.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't use Twitter in their hyperlinks. I wouldn't use Facebook.
No.
They're really sort of...
Ooh, and the Facebook are borderline with their hyperlinks, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, that's right. So that's the real power, because eventually you want some depth in the content.
Yeah.
You know, otherwise it can be a very, you know, you're sort of skating across the ice rather than digging deeper. And you made an interesting comment on Facebook interestingly about blogging almost shifting onto Facebook a little bit, which I sort of agree with. And I think that's a welcome thing for me because it gives Facebook more depth than it had.
Well,
but my question really is about, we still need depth, where does that come from?
okay, and good, thank you for that. Just to maybe give a bit of, you know, the whole thing about Facebook is if you're not paying for a service, you're the product. And that's dawning on more and more people. That you are being sold, your time, your attention, your interests are being sold to advertisers. Now, I take comfort in the fact that Facebook continually advertises self-administered catheters and bespoke radiator cabinets to me, just because I'm over 50, you know. So it's not tuned its algorithms quite right yet. Or single Russian ladies with unreasonably large breasts. I get a lot of them as well, but whatever. What Don's referring to is that I started, it's back to the thing about pragmatism and going where the energy is and where people are and what works. Now, I will always maintain my blog, because my blog is my space on the internet, and I own it. unlike everything else. But there's less traffic on blogs, less people invest the time in aggregators and finding blogs and following comments on blogs. So they were getting quieter. But I was getting good energy in Facebook. So what I decided to start doing was keeping my blog post, but also copying it and putting it into Facebook as well. And I'm having a ball. I mean, I'm getting something like 60 strong comments threads. Somebody said it was like watching one of the late night chat shows, watching my blog posts on Facebook. And it's just great because people are picking up the ball, they're looking at the topic, they're bouncing it backwards and forwards, having great conversations. And I don't care if it happens in Facebook or on my blog, if I can get that kind of exchange. And you're right, it is that I'm sort of showing how you can do it. And I think that's my job, is to try and encourage more people to raise the bar, talk more seriously in whatever platforms give you the greatest leverage and traction, without losing ownership at the same time, which I guess is back to that corporate kind of a question and point.
So just to follow up on your comments about Facebook, do you maintain different persona on Facebook? Is it your professional and personal?
Yeah.
Or integrated?
Interesting question. If you didn't hear it, that was, do I have different personae on Facebook, personal and professional? And it was interesting because when I left the BBC, I had that thought, I call myself Acme Consulting and pretend there's 5 of me, or just be me, and to continue to blog in the way that I'd always blogged. And I took the latter decision. So my blog's quite robust, and I say stuff that I'm sure makes some companies' toes curl, but it means I end up working with the right companies. So I made the decision to be as authentic as I could. So I have there's one me, well, there's multiple me's, but it's the same collection that you get on each platform. So I don't differentiate too much between LinkedIn or Facebook or different bits of Facebook or whatever.
Okay, we're going to have to call it quits there. So just a little
much.
tiny recap from me, just to kind of summarise that. A lot of tweetable content, lots of tweets. Nobody mentioned that radiator catheter thing he mentioned, so I just wondered if you would. That would have made a great tweet for retweets, and see the penetration on that one. But anyway, conversations are key, so ask questions and chatter. It's about distributed near instant person to person. I mean, those are some of the realities of it. I love this. I'm on the web, I'm on my device. Don't make me go somewhere else to learn. Real lesson there. Collective curiosity. Love that too. Great comment. And think a lot and take ridiculously small steps. So I'd hope after today, if you needed some convincing, you're going to take ridiculously small steps.
It's a small step down the lower, down the next floor of the show floor where the book's on sale in Wiley.
Boom. So it's been a great end. So let's just show our appreciation one more time to Euan Semple. Thank you very much.